GM Growth Fan, time for another episode. Today I have with me Andrew, who honestly, if you have not been living under a rock and are a human being in the 21st century, you've probably touched, worked, used a product of the brands that Andrew has worked with. So I think if at all anything, I can describe Andrew as a marketer who's done it all, seen it all, and him is here to tell the tale. So Andrew, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, buddy. No, it's true. I mean, I think in like in Web2 marketing, the holy grail, when I talk, a lot of my friends are CMOs and ECDs and, now run their own agencies. The holy grail for them is like, I want to make a TV show. I want to make a movie. I want to do a Super Bowl ad. To your point, like these are all things I've done over the years. Right. And so crypto for me was a little bit of, here's something I haven't done yet, you know? Yeah.
And just so the audience also knows, because I feel like people have seen you on their timelines very often, but sometimes they don't actually know how like Andrew's journey started. So Andrew's worked for Amazon. He was one of the first CMOs at Arbitrum, first CMO at Hashflow, obviously now CMO at Scale, and was actually advising Scale for a while, is an LP for a fund. I mean, Andrew, is there anything that you have set your eyes on but not done so far?
I mean, to be honest with you, like, in marketing, it's like you have a lot of different types of marketers, right? Like you have brand
Hmm.
marketers, performance marketers, B2B, B2C. Like I've done all these things, which was by design. But I think at the end of the day, like I am a creative at heart. I've created directed commercials with celebrities and things like that. And so a lot of times when people ask me like, what haven't you done yet that you want to do? It's gonna sound funny, but it's things like I want to write a children's book. I want to at some point probably build and launch my own consumer brand once tariff clarity is figured out, but for me, it's more, I think at this point in my life, things that I want to create or things that create passion for me. Like I collect vintage synthesizers. I want to make an album, but I don't want to become a celebrity or become rich. It's more just like creative fulfillment, right? So I think at this point, most of what I aspire to do is either honestly leave the world better than when I entered it. I'm a dad, right? Or do things that just candidly like stoke my creative juices. Yeah.
That's amazing. It's interesting that you mentioned some of the more creative campaigns that you worked with, but I wanted to understand like you were also one of the people that started SNL. Is that a true story? Because I don't know. I read that, but I didn't believe it.
Sort of. I'm not that old. I'm in my 40s. So the quick story was I had been working at Creative Artists Agency, which was like the leading talent agency in the world. And we had represented, Lorne Michaels, who's like the creator of SNL. We had represented Broadway Video, which is the production company of SNL. And a lot of what I was doing was I was like this nexus between Hollywood, Silicon Valley, and like Madison Avenue big advertisers. But I was also very early in like emerging tech. Like I was early in Web 2, like digital, social, literally worked with the Zuckerbergs, worked with, Biz Stone, who founded Twitter. And so I had a very different relationship with folks like Broadway Video. I was working with them over years to generate new business for them or help launch completely new entities for them. Right? They looked at me as like a friend and a supporter versus like a business person, right? And so when I ended up going over to NBC Universal, which we can talk about, one of the things that NBCU said, I said to NBCU was, I don't understand why we're not doing more interesting things with SNL. And the response was, well, we can't touch SNL. That's Lorne and that's Lorne. And I was like, okay. And so I just picked up the phone and called my friends at SNL and was like, why don't we do this, this, and this? And so I was the person who actually helped architect and launch the first ever digital extension of SNL in history. And so it was the first ever like original digital series. We got like a bunch of award nominations and things like that, but it was the entire cast. I mean, it was like, Pete Davidson and Bobby Moynihan and all those guys. And it was really successful. And we used brands to effectively finance the whole thing. We used all of kind of NBC Universal's like media engine to kind of market and distribute it. And I ended up actually working with SNL cast members for a pretty long time after that, which prior to my coming to NBCU was very like off limits. So I guess that's a lot of the joke at Amazon is they always ask like, what's your superpower? Like everybody has a superpower. And mine was the ability to seamlessly navigate complex people, organizations, and systems. And that's like one of the examples of, I would guess, like the complicated systems of NBCU that like no one had cracked the code on for years. And then I was like, 3 months in, here we go.
That's so interesting that you mentioned that because I was going to ask you, like, when you are pitching almost like a first of its kind, completely unique, innovative campaigns, walk me through the process of one, how do you build that? And second, when you're in a larger organization where innovation takes time to move, there's a lot of inertia that you have to move through. How do you build a framework for yourself and for stakeholders within the company to say, hey, this is a first of a kind campaign. It's unique, it's innovative, it's going to work. How do you build that process?
Yeah, let's start. I'm going to go backwards. Actually, like that was an Amazon thing. We call it working backwards. So the first is like, then how do you kind of push it through? And I think the key thing, this is what I was talking about with like navigating complex people and systems. Funny enough, like I studied organizational design. So I would say my actual like educational background is maybe more in like management consulting, systems, processes, all of that versus marketing. And I would say most of my marketing experience is self-taught, which we can talk about. And I think that's part of how I do this stuff is I'm not stuck inside, old archetypes and systems and things like that. But how do you push it through? I think what it boils down to is like, you have to understand, again, the organizational system structure and power dynamic, right? So example, when I'm at NBCU, I'm like, who is in control, right? It's obviously the chairman of NBC Universal, right? And then a level below that, I'm like, okay, well, it's very obvious to me that when it comes to the actual programming and distribution of the content, the creator of SNL has more power than the network executives, right? Like he's the one with the leverage. So I was like, well, then for me, I can't go to the network executives because they don't have the leverage, right? And then on the other side, I'm like, well, who else has leverage? I'm like the head of ad sales, right? The person who's responsible for monetizing all the content. Effectively, the monetization of that content is what then funds the creation of that content, right? And so that was it. So for the SNL example, it was like, well, here's what I have to do. I have to basically convince Lorne, who's like the power player, and then I have to convince the person that would effectively see the value from this financially, that also can explain to him the value of doing that to then drive more value back to him, right? And so that was pretty much it. It was, my picking up the phone, calling executives at his company that I had known for years, had built a relationship with, saying to them, here's what I want to do, here's why I want to do it, here's how this is going to benefit you. And then going to the money folks and saying, hey, I've been able to have this conversation that you've never been able to have. Here's where I think this is interesting. Here's how I think we could monetize this. And both sides are happy, right? Because it's both sides are getting things that are valuable to them. But I think that was always one of the issues, was that a lot of times the joke at MBAA was I was a translator because I could speak the language of Chick-fil-A, but then I could also speak the language of Ron Howard. I could speak the language of the Zuckerbergs, but then I could also speak the language of Ashton Kutcher. And a lot of times it's just, they speak different languages and they don't know how to bring those languages together. And so, whether it's a translator or a peer mediator, a lot of what I was doing was that, right? Speaking both sides and then bringing them together and then archetyping it or architecting it in a way that both sides could understand, that also both sides valued, right? And then in terms of how do I build this stuff, I would say it was really funny, probably about 20 years ago, in the traditional marketing world, like my aspiration at the time had been to be at Wieden & Kennedy, right? Wieden & Kennedy was where like the best marketing talent is. And I remember going to like the number one recruiter in that industry and saying, I want to be at Wieden & Kennedy. And she's like, but you're a jack of all trades and a master of none. And the way that, these agencies work is like, it's about being a master of one thing, not a jack of everything. And I just remember saying, I hear you, but I think long-term that's going to change. And I think what folks are really going to be looking for is like these 360 marketers. And I just was like, I'm one of the earlier folks, building this skill set that no one else is. I feel like they're going to value it. And, it was one of those things where it was like agree to disagree. And then funny enough, case in point, 10 years later, Wieden & Kennedy reached out to me directly and was like, would you be interested in maybe building this thing with us or for us? And then the recruiter reached out again and was like, you're right. I now have, 25 companies that would be interested in bringing you in as a CMO. But a lot of it, I think, is just getting very diverse, non-traditional experiences. A lot of times, so example would be when I created like television shows that were funded by brands, that came from spending time with producers and executives in Hollywood and understanding, how that system works and the framework. And then, on the brand side, well, how does a media deal work? And, and then how can I then use a media deal, but have it operate as a film financing deal or a TV financing deal instead of a media deal? And so I think, again, it has to do with like building this large knowledge base of a variety of different things, and then just taking a step back and going, how do I pull all those Lego pieces apart and then put them back together in a way that creates an even cooler, Lego set, I guess is maybe the way to put it. Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Like, so let's say if there is a early career marketer who's trying to build up their skill set, and because especially, and you said it so rightly, that almost having a 360-degree perspective, getting experiences from diverse backgrounds and trying to be able to cobble that together to build campaigns, to be able to execute and achieve growth. A lot of that, it's interesting because sometimes in tech we forget that sometimes you have to be sort of slightly out of the box. You have to think about how you can take something from F&B or entertainment and trying to be able to pull that in into tech. But I did want to ask you, like, especially earlier on in your career when you were getting exposure to a lot of these different things, how do you, let's say, advise a early career marketer to build up that skill set, especially in the age of AI when a lot of the work that we're going to do, generally speaking, might get automated. Being able to have the edge of having diverse experience becomes really important. So, like, what's your advice to them? How can they do that, practically speaking?
No, 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 100%. I think like I'm going to tell you some like mistakes that I see, because I've managed a lot of Gen Zs and I talk to a lot of Gen Zs, and I see folks making decisions that candidly are not going to benefit them in the long run. So, fun fact, I made minimum wage until I was 27 years old, right? And I graduated, magna cum laude, top 10 school. My friends became investment bankers and lawyers, and they were all making six figures. And here I am at the time. I think I was making $22,000, right? And everyone thought I was crazy. They're like, I don't understand. Why are you doing this? And the reason I did it was because CAA at the time was the most powerful company in Hollywood, and it was the nexus of everything in Hollywood. And I took a step back and was like, this is my grad school. This isn't a job. This is my grad school, right? I'm going to learn a ton, but then similar to going to HBS, I'm going to build arguably this extremely valuable and powerful network, which is true to this day. I still get calls from celebrity friends and managers and all these people that you can't access unless you've been in the industry. And so I looked at it as I'm going to grad school, but grad school's paying me 22,000, and I'm not putting myself into debt, right? And the reason I put up with making no money for so long was that entire time that I was there from 22 to 27, I felt like I was extracting more than I was giving, right? I was learning more than I was providing back, right? And I think in general, and this has been kind of how my whole career has operated, it's like I look at kind of career decisions in kind of three different areas. Like, number one is like, can I learn something new? Can I gain a skill set or gain some sort of knowledge base that I don't have already, which then makes me even more valuable, right? And then number two, do I feel like I'm being compensated fairly, right? And I think there's a big difference between like fair and what you want, right? And so for me, it wasn't ever being greedy. It wasn't, I want to make three times that. It was more like, I just want to feel like I'm being treated with respect and being, paid appropriately for the work that I'm doing, right? And then the third thing was the relationships that I could build. Could I build new relationships in a new sector that I didn't already have, right? And so case in point, like when I worked in Hollywood and I built that first division, I was like, this is great. I'm building all these relationships at major brands that I didn't already have, right? And then, like I said, when I eventually became a rich in Silicon Valley, I was like, this is great. I'm building VC relationships. I'm building big tech relationships, right? And so for me, it was worth continuing to maybe not make as much as I could somewhere else because I'm building this enormous Rolodex and I'm building this huge knowledge base that's just people don't have it. It's invaluable, right? And then typically what I say to folks is, then it's really about opportunity costs. It's like if I've built all those relationships and every new relationship is really not a net new positive, but just a duplication, well, that value proposition is gone, right? Or if I'm no longer learning anything new and I'm just teaching everyone else, well, that value proposition is gone. And then I'm like, okay, I'm getting paid fair. And then at that point, I'm like, well, if I'm not getting these two value props, then the comp maybe needs to be two or three times what it is, right? But that was never what I wanted. And so usually for me, it would be, okay, time to jump and find another place where I'm going to build a new network of relationships and gain a new knowledge base that I don't already have, right? And so I think as a marketer, that's really what it's about. I think crypto is very tricky. Like, I'm just going to be totally honest. I think there's an enormous talent deficit in crypto as it pertains to marketing. And I'm not here to crap on other marketers, but again, like over 20 years of experience, managing billion-dollar budgets, working with major blue chip brands. There's a big difference between that and someone that maybe worked at one direct to consumer business for 3 years and then came into crypto, right? Like very different. And so I think, part of the issue is if I were young right now, I'd be looking for someone that I can learn from. And I hate to say it, but I do think that if you're a young marketer, you're probably going to learn more from prolific and experienced Web 2 marketers than you are from most Web 3 marketers. And what my hope was 3 years ago, which hasn't come true, is that I thought more experienced, prolific Web 2 marketers would come into crypto and start to build their teams and all of that. And there's a number of reasons I think that hasn't happened. But I do think, again, if you're a young marketer and you're like, I want to be a great marketer, you're probably going to learn more in Web 2 than you are in Web 3.
It's a pretty controversial statement to say, Andrew, don't you
Bro,
think?
I'm
No,
telling you,
no, it makes a
in
lot of
all be
sense.
honest, like some of the best marketers I know that came into Web3, they've left and gone back to Web2. And it's part of the reason why we're not getting more and more good marketers coming in. And it's a big issue. Like I was even talking to a friend, a pretty like prolific VC friend the other day, and they agreed. They're like, there's this enormous marketing talent deficit, and more investments coming in, more companies are launching. The need for marketers continues to grow, and the supply continues to either stay stagnant or decrease, you know? Yeah.
Isn't it ironical to think about that this industry started from the perspective of, okay, it's going to be for techies, it's going to be for developers, it's going to be for engineers. You still feel it's dominated by them. And now we're going into a world where engineers are definitely going to be important, but a lot of their work, a lot of the time that was spent building products, thinking about tech, implementing tech is going to become easier and easier as time passes by. And everybody's talking about like distribution's important, but now you have a shortage of marketers within the industry. I wanted to understand, like,
one quick thing I'll tell you is like there was this joke in, when I worked in like, big tech and even like early digital Web2 stuff, there was always this joke of like great products sell themselves. And it's not true. And I'll tell you, even when I worked at Amazon, like I worked on this kind of tiger team under Jeff that controlled like the $6 billion budget. And we did, all the really big marketing for Amazon globally. Jeff got it. Like, I have to say, like, he was really smart. And, what he understood is he's like, yeah, like you do need a great product. He's like, but it is about, making sure the right people know about it at the right time, and that, the value propositions align with their needs or their deficits or things like that. And so I do think in Web2 tech now, like most folks, even Apple and Tesla, I think they understand that great products don't sell themselves. I think the problem in crypto, candidly, is a lot of founders either come from academia or they're what's called IC developers, meaning like I was a coder, whereas at Amazon, I worked with what are called like cross developers, where they'd work with marketing and finance and all these teams. And so you have these folks that have just never been exposed to marketing, or candidly never exposed to P&Ls, scaling a business, what happens when you raise venture capital, all of these things. And so the challenge becomes, I think a lot of great marketers will come in, one, not be given the time to really learn and understand crypto and the nuances. And then I think two, a lot of times you have founders where they think that marketing's job is to drive market cap. And I'm just going to be honest with you, like most people that are crypto native understand this at this point, but like market cap and marketing have very little to no correlation. I would say that the two things that genuinely move market cap are macro and manipulation. And, for folks like me that are American and ethical, I'm not going to do unethical things and illegal things to move a market cap. And if a founder doesn't understand this, you're dealing with an uphill battle. But I'll tell you what you can do, and this is what I do, is I can drive users, significant user growth, which can then translate into significant transaction growth, building awareness. No one knew you existed. Now everybody does. Building positive sentiment, making sure people understand the value propositions and differentiators of your product, right? These are all things that marketers truly can do. And I think, again, shout out to Jack Holleran, like there are some founders, because he was a, two-time Silicon Valley founder, that understand this, but a lot don't. And I think that's why you get a lot of great marketers come in and they're up against a battle that they can never win, Yeah.
no, absolutely. And I was gonna like ask you this, but especially because you came from the Web2 background, worked with massive companies, massive budgets, so on and so forth. When you are trying to build a growth strategy, like I want to break it down almost from like an anatomy of a growth strategy. When you're looking at the different elements of that, especially with highly technical products, I feel like, especially over the past 3 years, scale itself went through a journey of being just a zero gas fee solution to now having a specific niche, having extensive growth, almost finding its footing in place and being able to, well, scale really quickly. So I do want to ask you, like, when you are building a growth strategy, what are sort of the building blocks, especially from both a analytical and a creative perspective? When you're balancing those two elements from both obviously you have market data, you have user data, and they're also trying to build in your creative instincts in that so that you can set yourselves apart in a crowded market. What are those building blocks that a growth strategy like that is going to have?
Yeah, I'm gonna get controversial again. One thing I've seen in crypto for the past 3 years that really gets under my skin is the amount of people that position themselves as growth marketers. What is growth marketing? Growth marketing is performance marketing, and performance marketing is something that's existed, I would argue, for a long time, but like really became prolific in the D2C days, the Casper mattresses and things like that, right? What is performance marketing? Performance marketing is this notion of, every dollar I spend is going to drive X results, right? And those results can be things like, clicks, site traffic, but it can also be things like media efficiency, right? Like I'm doing this and here's the CPM rate, here's the cost for 1,000 eyeballs. And, it's all about getting that cost down until you get to a point that you can't get it down any further. Or it could be, again, impressions based where you're like, I'm scaling up impressions from an efficiency standpoint, but eventually I'm going to reach what's called a point of saturation. And at that point, every dollar I spend is going to give me diminishing returns, right? And I think like the thing that I find funny is whenever I've tried to hire a growth marketer in this industry, the first question I ask them is, so you're a performance marketer, right? And a lot of them are like, what's performance marketing? And at that point, I'm like, you're not a growth marketer. You're like a crypto native marketer, right? It's like, sure, you know how to use a questing platform, which is nonsense anyways. But, at the end of the day, and this is a big reason I went to Amazon is like, I did performance marketing when I worked with a lot of D2C brands because I had helped, I was like the CMO of a Google-backed startup. But everyone had always told me like Amazon was like the center of excellence for performance marketing. And it's true. And so people would always ask me like, how does your team have such an enormous budget, like $6 billion? And I was like, I'll tell you why. It's because we are not a cost center. We are a profit center, which if you're a marketer listening right now, you're probably like scratching your head going like, what are you talking about? So in all brands, like marketing's a cost center. It's like, it's a necessary thing that you have to pay for to grow your brand and be successful, but like it's money out the door, right? And at Amazon, and I can't, obviously share the secret sauce, we figured out how to do it where, the $6 billion we were spending was then equating to more than $6 billion of revenue in the company. And so all we had to do every year with Jeff is say, here's the increase in spend that we want to spend. Here's the increase in revenue that's going to generate. And that's how we had the largest marketing budget in the world. And so, yeah, I think that's a huge thing, which cannot, by the way, be replicated at companies that aren't of the size and scope of Amazon. But in terms of like, how do you approach it? I think we call it, because I am a performance marketer, we call it like the test and learn strategy, right? And I'll give you an example. I think you know this, but like I'm an advisor for Addressable, who's programmatic ad technology using wallet data targeting. Israeli ad tech guys have been working with them for, I guess, about 2 years now, really helping to kind of steer the product and vision. And I think they're doing an incredible job. But an example there might be, I'll use a real tangible example, right? So with Scale, we launched a program. Well, we integrated Sushi Swap, and it was the first time where like you could trade gas free, you could LP gas free, right? And so what I wanted to do was obviously a whole slew of experiments, right? So on one side, your experiment can be targeting, right? So it might be, okay, one group, I want to target our wallets that interact with Sushi Swap X amount of times a week. Maybe like another group I want to target are wallets that interact X times a week, but also have a total balance of a minimum of Y. Or maybe I also want to target folks that have a Sushi Swap token regardless of whether they use it, right? So those are all kind of, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And then the other thing you might be testing is creative, right? So you might be testing creative that's more sushi branded versus Scale. You might be testing alternative creative that's more Scale versus sushi. You might be, again, using different messaging. One might be an incentive-based messaging. One might be a value-based messaging. One might be an efficiency-based messaging, right? And so what you're trying to do at the end of the day is effectively run a ton of like micro experiments. And then what you're doing is in real time, you're monitoring those and you figure it out pretty quickly. You're like, okay, of all the creative, this is the creative that's driving the most click-throughs, right? So scrap all the other creative and put everything into that creative, right? And then in terms of targeting, I've had many situations where I'm doing, let's call it like micro campaigns across 6 geographic regions. And then, halfway through the campaign, I'm like, scrap, 7 of the 10, double down on these 3. And then, in the next campaign, it's like you have all those learnings and you're taking it to the next level. So now you're like, I'm starting with this creative, but I'm going to create more alternative versions of it again to see if I can get it even more, optimized. And then maybe I'm targeting the same countries, but maybe I'm like, you know what? Now I'm going to go city level targeting, and I'm not just targeting, Russia, but I'm targeting St. Petersburg and Moscow. And oh my gosh, St. Petersburg is 2x performing Moscow. Now all my money's going into St. Petersburg, right? So, but that's, a lot of what I did at Amazon, just to be candid with you, was they would say, hey, Andrew, we haven't cracked the code on podcasts. We haven't cracked the code on influencers. We haven't cracked the code on tour sponsorships, sports sponsorships. We haven't cracked the code on how do we advertise on Netflix, on Hulu, on HBO Max, all these things. And then what they would do is they would give me, a couple $1 million, and I had a data science team in India that I worked with, and we would run experiments together for anywhere from, I would say, 3 months to some of them took like 12 months. And then me and the data science team, we'd crack the code. And then I'd go back to headquarters and say, hey guys, crack the code on podcasts. Here's exactly how to do it. Here's exactly what the ROI is. Here's exactly what the saturation point is, best practices. And then it would be great. Now here's $10 million. Let's start doing podcasts. And then the next year, maybe it's let's ramp it up to 20 million, right? So, but performance marketing is it's all about optimization against what we call HVAs, high value actions. And it's a science. It really is.
When it does come to something like, because I know you've spoken about this, which is stickiness, right? And I feel like, especially within the Web3 context, it becomes an afterthought because a lot of the times companies are able to grow really quickly, spending money on doing giveaways, building incentives. So I'd say, even I'll go so far as to say controversial thing is I'd say about 80% of projects in the space have a respectable TVL, mostly because of incentives, not
No, no,
because
no.
they have a
Wait, let's
great
pause.
product.
Let's pause for a second. I'm gonna get spicy. One thing I hate about this industry is how much projects manipulate metrics. And there's a book about this that I'm sure they've all read, and I've read it, but they manipulate metrics to effectively manipulate mind share or manipulate actions. And I don't support it. I think it's completely unethical. I think we need to, as an industry, grow the F up and stop looking at retail as our exit. I think it's morally wrong, and I don't support it. And so with TVL, it's very simple. Where does TVL come from? One, treasury tokens. So if you're at a project that has an enormous amount of treasury tokens, those are sitting on your chain as TVL. Number two, stable coins. Once you have that treasury TVL, they're probably going to match it with stable coins, right? And then there's a lot of what I call pay for play deals where you will call, maybe a liquid fund and say, hey, I want you to park $50 million on my chain, and I will effectively pay a rental fee every month for you doing that. And so, it's one of those tricky things where people are like, well, if not that metric, what metric? And I'm like, I'm not here to tell you I believe this metric or that metric is better. I'm just saying I think TVL is very manipulated and very not transparent. And I'll give you an example of this. And I love these guys, no FUD against them, but the Berachain TVL recently had been going parabolic. And I was like, as a marketer, I was like, I want to understand what's doing this. And what it was instead of their airdrop supporting airdrop farmers, it was supporting yield farmers, right? And you could go on this website that was a project on Berachain, and it was offering you these insane APY incentives to deposit into pools. And so this one project on Berachain was effectively driving that TVL through the roof. And someone asked me, they're like, this is an interesting model. Is this great? And I was like, it is an interesting model, but I don't think it's sustainable. I said, once those API percentages decrease, you're going to see the same thing happen to TVL. And sure enough, I believe it was like about a week ago that TVL had plummeted directly as a result of those API incentives decreasing, right? And so that's what I'm saying is that the problem with a lot of these incentive-based models is they're great at creating that narrative of, oh, our TVL is going parabolic, or, oh, our revenue is going parabolic. Or I'll give you another one. There are a lot of games that I know that call me because they built on a chain, right? And I won't name the chain. And they're like, we thought that this chain had tons of gamers because we've seen these user numbers and everyone on Twitter is like, they're the gaming chain. And I was like, I'm telling you, they're not. And then they come back to me and eventually they're like, we have no one playing our game. And I was like, because those numbers aren't real. They're manipulated, right? And they're like, yeah, but everybody talks about them on Twitter. And I'm like, well, it's because they paid 100 calls to talk about them consistently and build what's called a fake perception, right? That they're a leading gaming chain, right? And so then what happens is these builders call me, and Scale's the example, and they're like, we want to launch on Scale. And then the next thing you know, they've got 10,000 players because Scale actually had real users and we didn't manipulate the metrics, right? But I think just in general in crypto, you have to be really careful whether you're, an employee, an advisor, an investor, because a lot of this stuff is just not actually factual. And I do think you're going to have some class action lawsuits in the future from folks where they're like, I bought this token because I thought X, Y, and Z. You manipulated X, Y, and Z. It's no different than influencers that don't disclose paid shills. It's misleading.
No, absolutely. And it really is a interesting thing to look at because it's almost obvious that this is a really easy problem to solve, that you disclose that you've been paid by a company to talk about them, not just from a perspective of being ethical, but also if tomorrow that company goes bad, or you essentially promoted a rug pull, you're ethically safe because they just paid you to talk about it. But I think what I
Safe though, and that's it's no, it's funny though. So some of the largest coals in the industry, I actually have been mentoring for years. Like I don't really talk about it, just helping them because I'm like, I think you're a good ethical human, and I want you to be successful and like effectively wipe out the BS, right? And I'll give you a great example. Like one of the folks that I've worked with is Dynamo Patrick, great guy, right? And he actually said to me early on, like, because I brought him in on scale, he was like, "Are you okay with me disclosing that this is paid for?" And I said, "Absolutely." And I said, "Why are do you get other projects that ask you not to?" And he goes, "Yeah, of course, all the time, but I've really been trying to push folks to let me disclose." And I'll tell you, I said, you should, because here's what's going to happen in the future. If the FTC wants to go after influencers, they're not going to go after the brand that paid them. They're going to go after the person that shilled it that didn't disclose. And I saw this in Web 2 because I had been working with folks like the Kardashians and Justin Bieber in the early days of Twitter. Like Twitter was brand new. And I remember in the early days, celebrities would do what DeFi calls are doing now, which is like talk about products they love, but not disclose that they were paid for. And then there was a huge FTC lawsuit where all of them basically got sued. Some of them were able to kind of skirt through it, but a lot of them had to actually pay the FTC, and the brands that paid them to do it didn't get in any trouble, right? So if you're the front lines of communication, like you're the one that's going to get in trouble, not the person that paid you, you know?
Oh, absolutely. How do you think though, like maybe you can talk about it from skills perspective, or I even look at something like Million. I also look at addressable, the B2B example, but I also really respect the TMS that's been on the podcast as well. I want to understand, like, when you are trying to build retention, when you're trying to build a use case, you want people to continually use your product, all of the, let's say, basic elements the exact same as they are in Web 2, as is the case in Web 3? Or do you feel like, are there any differences that product teams, marketing teams should be paying attention to, baking into their product and seeing like how they can increase their retention through that?
Yeah. So I'm going to say something that like a lot of people might disagree with, but like marketing in Web3 is actually not very different from marketing in Web2. The difference is the user base, right? So crypto natives, and we call this segmentation, right? Segmentation. The crypto native segmentation is very different than what I would call like the mass market segmentation, right? These are folks that are contrarian. These are folks that, again, are loyal to their bags, all of these different things, right? And you can take like gaming as just even a subsector. Like a traditional gamer, I'm a gamer. I've been a gamer for 20 years. I've worked with every major kind of gaming company you can think of. But like for me, I play fighting games. I just like them. I have fun. I have no intention of like winning money from playing them, right? And so for me, like if I download a new game and want to play it, if it's fun, I'll keep playing it. If it's not fun, I'm going to stop playing it, right? Whereas quote unquote Web3 gamers, they may like gaming, but the motivation of them gaming isn't about the enjoyment. It's about making the money, right? And they may say, oh, well, but I want to have fun and make money, right? But like they're two contrasting motivators, like fun and money, right? And so the problem becomes if you're targeting just the natives, it's going to be really hard to build a sticky user base because, again, you have to create an incentive stream that eventually is not going to become sustainable, right? And so that was a big reason why I had actually chosen to go to scale, because at this point in my career, I would say like the bulk of most major chains have approached me at some point to say, be our CMO, be our advisor, something like that. And the reason I chose scale, this time versus some of the maybe bigger known names or higher market cap names was this gas-free frictionless technology. And for me, the way I looked at it was I was like, okay, so on scale, you can launch an iOS game or an Android game or a PC game, and effectively you can just download the app, and play it, right? There's no, I have to set up a wallet. There's no, I have to add chains to the wallet. I have to add gas tokens to the wallet, like none of that, right? And so I said, well, at the end of the day, if I'm trying to drive users, which is a marketer's metric that actually can be controlled, at a centralized exchange, you don't have the friction, right? But at most crypto projects, you have extreme friction, right? And that's why they're all recycling the same users that aren't loyal. And I was like, well, scale doesn't have the friction. And so great example of this, I could work with a Twitch gamer, not a Web3 gaming coal, to play a fun game on the Epic Game Store, tell people to download it and play it, never once mention blockchain or crypto. All these folks download the game, they enjoy it, they keep playing it for the joy of it. And then maybe 5 years from now, we tell them, by the way, did you realize like you own those skins? And by the way, did you realize that they're worth something? And by the way, did you realize that you can sell them? And so that frictionless experience was something that I wasn't going to get at other places. Other examples I can give you of this that I like Jupiter, right? So Jupiter Dex Aggregator on Solana, they have a mobile app, you can download it, right? Or Phantom, they have a mobile app, you can download it. But I think again, like unless as a project you're creating a frictionless onboarding experience, you're always going to be stuck effectively targeting this native segmentation that's probably never going to be a loyal user for you, or it's going to cost too much for you long term to make them a loyal user. Yeah.
Or it's going to cost too much to change what they really care about. Or you're trying to almost define like a
Yeah.
totally new market that, I mean, people don't say it, but most crypto traders or people who are users are gamblers. Like that's what it is at the end of the day. Not saying that they're, I
Yeah,
feel
I
like
wouldn't go as far. I wouldn't go as far as to say they're gamblers. Like, yes, there is definitely a like, let's call it this. Like my friends that are big meme coiners, like, yes, they're gamblers. They're like super high risk, super high reward. I do think
I'd
like
say
I'll use my
most of them, maybe.
yeah.
Maybe
Yeah,
most of them. Yeah.
a lot of them are gamblers, but I would say like, use me as an example. Like I'm a trader, but I'm not really a gambler, but I will take on risk, right? And so, when I'm building out a portfolio, NFA DYOR, obviously my largest holding tends to be Bitcoin. And I understand that the upwards momentum of Bitcoin may not be the same as that of a small cap or a mid cap. But again, like I'm 42 and I'm looking for stability and certainty, right? But it's not uncommon that I'll say, oh, I really like this one project that has a 50 million market cap, but actually has really good fundamentals, a seamless onboarding process. They just don't have a marketer. And so no one knows they exist. And then I might take, a decent chunk of change and throw it into that. But I would say that's not as much gambling as, someone that's just like, on Meteora or Pump Fund, like just trying to catch bids on things the second they launch. I mean, but yes, there's a huge gambling segment for sure. Yeah.
No, that's I do agree. One thing I do want to ask you, like, especially when you're marketing in a space where, let's say, being in a layer like Scale, who is competing for mind shares, competing for users, competing for DAOs in an overcrowded space, right, where attention deficit is at the peak. When you're trying to build a unique narrative for a brand in a highly competitive, very noisy space where grabbing attention is really difficult. How do you do that? How do you process that? How do you like take
Yeah.
steps to mitigate that?
It's a great question. I mean, I think, for anyone that's like a traditional marketer, you probably already know this. So in crypto, we call it narratives, but in traditional marketing, we call it category design, right? It's this notion of like, I am designing a new category from the ground up. I love this actually. It's on HBO Max. It's called Game Changers. It was like a 10-part series about the video game industry. And funny enough, it had like the original CMOs and stuff of like different gaming companies, some of which like I've worked with over the years, which is kind of cool. But you see this quite a bit. You see it where Sega Genesis comes out and they're like, we need to effectively create this completely new category to try to overtake Nintendo. And so a lot of times that's kind of what narrative design is like, and I'll tell you kind of how it works in crypto. A lot of times the narratives actually come from the VCs. So what'll happen is like a VC will invest, 50, $100 million into a project. And then to your point, it's like, okay, we need to do some category design work to try to get this to actually break through the noise, right? And examples would be like when you look at Celestia and Modular, that's an example. There's a bunch of these. Or if you look at Barachain, like proof of liquidity, these are category design, right? And so I think the first thing you have to do is you have to say like, what categories can I design that actually makes sense, right? And then you're like, and then is there PMF, product market fit, for these categories with either existing or new user bases, right? And so an example, I would say, I'm just trying to think like, well, yeah, so for Scale, for very, very simple, I was like, are effectively the only gas-free blockchain. In the back of my head, I was like, that's a very powerful thing, right? Because anyone that's native understands gas and the limitations. But the more important thing is like, because we're gas free, it enables our technology to be invisible, right? And when you talk to a lot of developers, a big pain point for them is like, I can't onboard users because of this burdensome and friction up front of onboarding, right? And when you talk to users, there's also this frustration of like, oh my God, I have to go through all these different steps, or like I'm out of gas on this wallet, or oh, it's split against 6 different chains. And this is why you're now even seeing dApps where like you sign in with an email address and a password, and it's building a backend wallet. It's like removing this, right? And so I was like, I think our number one value proposition for a developer is the fact that like we can be invisible, we can be in the background, especially if you're gaming where, you know, traditional gamers already have kind of a negative sentiment towards blockchain and crypto, right? And so for us, we just leaned into this notion of the gas-free invisible blockchain, right? And I think the key with narrative development or category design is, you know, marketing is still at the end of the day, it's about reach and frequency, right? So it's like you've got to be putting out the same messaging consistently for long periods of time, because otherwise what you're going to do is you're not going to break through, or you're going to create confusion. Like, great example I could give you is I've noticed with Polygon, like they shift their narrative. They don't, I mean, they're not really like on the timeline anymore, but back in the day, it was like they're always shifting their narrative. And I was like, you're diluting your brand, because at the end of the day, you're creating customer confusion. And then as a result, like you don't really stand for anything, right? Whereas at scale for the entire past year, it was the gas-free invisible blockchain, right? So anyone that, you know, has dove deep on scale now knows like, well, that's the blockchain that doesn't have gas fees, or oh, that's the blockchain that you can hide behind your dApp, right? And that is reach and frequency, right? I think the other thing you have to take into account is, again, this notion of reach and frequency. So, you know, if you are, for example, a company like AVAX that has this enormous treasury, you can pay to have 100 Coles on the timeline shilling you as a leading gaming chain every day, right? So that's a lot of reach and a lot of frequency that's obviously paid for and not organic. But again, that will then build up this fake perception of AVAX as a leading gaming chain, like mission accomplished, right? So I do think there's also something to be said about like budget. You know, I know what the budgets are of most chains. I know exactly line item wise how they spend those budgets. I will tell you, most budgets that I've analyzed are grossly misspent and misused in terms of being effective. Like, and I think that was one of the things at Scale was I said to Jack, I was like, for every dollar you give me, I could probably have it perform like $5 to $10 of another chain based on what I'm seeing. You know, sure enough, we had some pretty massive growth this year, even in a bear market. But again, it's tricky, right? Because you have to also remember marketing is a compound effect, right? The marketing you do today doesn't impact today, it impacts tomorrow. And the more you do it with the more frequency, with the more consistency, it really adds up. And a lot of times I say, you know, year 4 or 5 is when things really start to take off. Like, I'll give you an example. Like, if you're an American, you probably now know this hot sauce called Fly by Jing, right? You probably didn't know about it 3 years ago. But again, like, they've done some really solid, in my opinion, consistent marketing with good frequency and good targeting. And now it's broken through, right? It's like, it's in the consciousness, it's in the consideration set. And so I do think that's another big thing is when I look at chains that have been spending, the numbers that I hear tend to be like 10 to $20 million a year consistently for 5-6 years. They've got the compounded benefit of that, right? Whereas at Scale, you know, we effectively didn't start doing any paid marketing until I started a year ago. So we, you know, effectively were, you know, 5 years behind in terms of compounded benefit, right? So, you know, you have to sometimes, if that's the case, and you're, let's call it the challenger brand, and I'll use Pepsi and Coke. Sometimes what you have to do is in year 1, you have to outspend your competitors. You have to say, hey, if we just do this, it's going to take us 5 years to catch up. So how do we catch up in 3? We outspend them, you know? Yeah.
Would you say it's just outspend, or maybe some part of it is also outmaneuver some of your competitors? Because I feel like, especially, it's true for Scale as well, right? Some of the examples that you stated, obviously, Scale's. And I think even 3 years back when I got to know about the project, like Jack still had a huge focus on gaming because the use case just made a lot of sense at that point in time. It just wasn't known by most of the people that knew about Scale at the point in time. Do you also feel like some of that is outmaneuvering competitors as well?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. But like, here's the challenge. Like I was saying, it's like, as you can tell, like I did performance marketing at Amazon, right? There are not a lot of people with these types of skill sets in the industry. And what I've also noticed is you get a lot of these grifters that come in and they're like, I'm building an agency or I'm building a consultancy. But you dig in and look at the experience of the people at these companies, and like, it is not impressive, in my opinion, right? Like, I have a million friends that are marketers in Web2 that are very impressive folks. And if those folks came in and started agencies, I'd say, yeah. But I think that's the challenge is like in Web2, a lot of times the team at the brand is not the most sophisticated team, and they know it. And then what they're doing is they're hiring great agencies to effectively help them be smarter and more sophisticated. And that can be media buying agencies, digital strategy agencies, DR agencies, you know, all these different things, right? But in crypto, because these are startups, like they can't afford those agencies. Like most of those media agencies, minimum spend $10 million a year. That's larger than a lot of projects' budgets, right? And so at the end of the day, I hate to say it, but like what I see at most projects is a lot of just like, let's spend a lot of money. Let's throw a lot of darts against the wall. Let's see what sticks and cross our fingers, which is fine, but there's just a lot of waste, right? Versus like where I'm at Scale and I'm doing like a ton of test and learn experimentation to basically optimize what we call the marketing mix or the media mix to optimize my strategy. And then once I've optimized it, I'm like, this is the strategy. Now we just continue to spend against it until we reach point of saturation. And then at that point, that's the right number, right? And so I think the problem becomes like, yes, out maneuvering folks 100%. But if you don't have captains that can drive those ships, how do you expect to outmaneuver anyone? And I hate to say it, but like I've met in this industry over time, maybe 10 marketers that I think could like work at Amazon headquarters, like I've met a lot of folks that, and that's the other thing in marketing is like, there's great brand marketers, but they don't know anything about performance marketing. There's great performance marketers, but they don't know anything about brand marketing. And I'll give you like the analogy here that I always love. It's a fishing analogy, right? So when I was working with the D2C brands, like the Caspers of the world, it was like, Andrew, we're like 100% performance marketing focused, right? And then when I was working with the Coca-Colas and the Nikes, it was a lot more like brand marketing focus, right? And you have to do both. And the biggest mistake that I see is a lot of early stage founders are like performance. I want every dollar to be optimized. But like, here's the analogy. So it's fishing, right? So if you're doing performance marketing, what you're doing is you're like, I have a pond with 20 fish and I'm going to fish all 20 fish out as fast and as cheaply as humanly possible. Great. Now you're out of fish, right? What brand marketing does is while you're doing the performance marketing, it's consistently making the pond larger and stocking it with more fish so that your performance marketer keeps fishing and doesn't stop at 20, right? And so when you're launching an early stage brand, you have to remember whether you're a believer in the marketing funnel, which I still believe in, or you're a believer in the marketing cycle, which I'm also a believer in, you still have to understand that like if no one knows your product exists, you're not going to convert them, right? And so if you are not doubling or tripling down on brand awareness, building brand love, building positive perceptions, making sure people understand and know your differentiation points, like you're never going to convert folks at the bottom of the funnel. Like you're not, and so, shout out to folks like Phantom, I think's done a great job. I think MetaMask recently has been doing a really nice job, but like there are certain Magic Eden, I think's done a nice job, but like there's brands out there where like they have definitely Solana's done a nice job. These are folks that have done a lot of brand marketing. And I think now years later are benefiting from those results. And then at that point they can say, okay, a lot of people know we exist now. A lot of people love us. Maybe now we start to shift more of our budget into performance versus brand, right? But a lot of brands that I see in this industry are like still focused on brand and performance, and no one knows they exist.
It's so damn true because, like, even with my conversation with Asaf, also was something along the same lines that a lot of the times brands are thinking, like, okay, I'm going to throw money at performance marketing, throw money at ads. That's going to get me the users, devs, exposure that I need, so on and so forth, and not considering the fact that branding plays a huge role in that and it takes time to build out. It's not going to happen in a year. Might take 2, might take 3, might take 4 even. But eventually it will happen. People will know about you and that trust will get built and you cannot fast track that. One final question that I have for you was, what is one piece of marketing advice that you could give to the world that can change their whole philosophy of how they look at or approach this practice?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, maybe I'll keep it more action. I'm going to make it more actionable towards crypto. And this will be more of like a message to founders. So TLDR founders, we have a huge deficit of good marketing talent in this industry, right? And I do think you are the reason, right? And so what do you need to do? Number one, you need to be willing to take folks from Web 2 that have great marketing experience and bring them over. And that means you might have to be paying Web 2 salaries or giving them Web 2 equity. Number two, you have to acknowledge that like this is a very technical, complicated industry. So you as founders either need to teach and educate these folks or give them enough runway to really learn this stuff, right? And then I think you need to give them a lot of latitude. You need to understand that, again, it does require a lot of test and learn. The timeline for success in marketing is often, 4 or 5 years. So I think, again, like if you're serious, then take it seriously, double down and do it the right way, because you're either going to completely waste your budgets or you're going to burn incredible people and they're going to leave the industry. I think it's just so important. And I think like this is how we eventually, evolve this industry, as we bring in great marketing talent and we retain that marketing talent. And I just unfortunately have seen so many great folks like come in, get burned and then go back. And I think it's holding us back. I really do.
Awesome. Well, Andrew, I can probably take this conversation even longer, but I have to let you go. Thank you so much for doing this. It was a real pleasure and honor to host you.
Yeah, likewise.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone who tuned in. See you in the next episode. GM and bye-bye.